An arrogant duke showed up to her family dinner. It was love at first sight. Some people meet at ballrooms, others in gardens beneath the moon. Lucille Thornfield met the Duke of Ashford over roasted pheasant and barely concealed contempt. He arrived uninvited, unbearably smug, and utterly convinced the world revolved around his title. She couldn't stand him from the moment he opened his aristocratic mouth. But somewhere between the sharp words and sharper glances, between duty and defiance, between what they were supposed to be and what they truly wanted, everything changed. This is not a gentle love story. This is a collision. If you're ready to witness how hate becomes hunger and how two stubborn souls find each other in the most impossible way, subscribe now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Let's begin. The dining room at Thornfield Manor smelled of beeswax candles and rosemary. Golden light pooled across the mahogany table, catching the edges of silver cutlery arranged with military precision. Lucille Thornfield sat at her father's right, her empire waist gown the color of winter moss, her posture flawless. She'd perfected the art of looking interested while mentally cataloguing all the reasons she despised these formal dinners. Her father, Lord Edward Thornfield, sat at the head of the table like a general surveying his troops. His grey hair caught the candlelight, his expression carved from stone. Across from Lucille, her younger brother Timothy fidgeted with his cravat, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Her mother, Lady Margaret, smiled that practiced smile that meant absolutely nothing. "The Havisham estate is quite lovely this time of year," Lady Margaret said, her voice floating across the table like perfume. "Perhaps we should accept their invitation for tea next week." Lucille murmured something non-committal. She lifted her wine glass, watching the candlelight refract through the burgundy liquid. Outside, rain had begun to tap against the tall windows, a steady rhythm that matched the pulse of boredom thrumming through her veins. Then, the door opened. Not gently, not with the soft announcement of the butler, but with purpose. Lucille's gaze snapped toward the entrance. A man stepped into the dining room, and the air itself seemed to shift. He was tall, absurdly tall, with shoulders that filled his navy coat like he'd been poured into it. Dark hair, almost black, fell across his forehead, in a way that suggested he either didn't care or cared too much. His jawline could have been carved from Carrara marble, sharp and unforgiving. But it was his eyes that arrested her, cold, steel grey, and fixed directly on her father. "Lord Thornfield," the stranger said, his voice deep and smooth as aged whiskey. "I hope I'm not interrupting." The lie was so blatant it might as well have been written across his forehead. Lucille's father rose slowly, his napkin sliding from his lap. "Your Grace." The words came out stiff, formal. "We weren't expecting you." "Your Grace." A duke. Of course. The stranger, this duke, smiled. It wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile a wolf gives before it strikes. "I was passing through the county, thought it only proper to pay my respects." Another lie. Lucille could taste it. Her father gestured toward the table, his movements mechanical. "Please, join us." The Duke moved with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no. He took the chair directly across from Lucille, and for the first time since he'd entered, his gaze landed on her. It hit like a physical thing. His eyes traveled across her face, not leering, not dismissive, but assessing, like she was a puzzle he intended to solve before dessert. Lucille held his stare, refusing to look away first. She could feel her pulse ticking at her throat, could feel the weight of his attention pressing against her skin. "And you are?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Lucille Thornfield," she said, her voice cooler than the rain outside. "Thomas Volkov," he replied. "Duke of Ashford." A Russian name. That explained the slight accent threading through his perfect English, the way certain syllables curled at the edges. "Volkov," Lucille repeated, testing the weight of it. "Like the wolf." His smile deepened, revealing a dimple on his left cheek that absolutely should not have been attractive. "Exactly like the wolf, Miss Thornfield." Lady Margaret cleared her throat, the sound delicate but pointed. "How fortunate that you found us, Your Grace. We were just discussing the upcoming season in London." Thomas's attention didn't waver from Lucille. "Were you?" It wasn't a question. Lucille lifted her wine glass again, using the motion to break eye contact. She took a measured sip, letting the silence stretch. Around them the servants moved like shadows, placing a setting before the Duke, pouring wine, adjusting the candelabra. "I imagine the season holds little interest for you, Your Grace," Lucille said, setting her glass down with exaggerated care, "given how often you seem to avoid it." She felt Timothy's sharp intake of breath beside her. Her mother's smile froze. Her father's fork stilled mid-air. Thomas, however, looked delighted. "You've been keeping track of my social calendar, Miss Thornfield." His eyebrow arched, a dark slash against his pale skin. "I'm flattered." Heat crept up Lucille's neck. "Hardly. But when a duke fails to attend multiple events at Almax, people notice. People talk. Let them." He leaned back in his chair, completely at ease, like he owned not just his seat, but the entire manor. "I've never found much value in dancing with simpering debutantes who can't hold a conversation beyond the weather." Lucille's fingers tightened around her fork. "How enlightened of you. Though I imagine the debutantes are equally relieved to avoid your company." "Lucille," her father said, his voice carrying a warning sharper than the knife beside his plate. But Thomas laughed. Actually laughed. A low, rich sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "Your daughter has spirit, Lord Thornfield. That's rare." "My daughter has opinions," her father corrected, his jaw tight. "Sometimes too many of them." "Opinions are dangerous," Thomas agreed, his gaze still locked on Lucille. "Especially in women." The words landed like a slap. Lucille set her fork down slowly, deliberately. "And arrogance is unbecoming in men, Your Grace. Yet here we are." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Timothy made a choking sound. Lady Margaret pressed her napkin to her lips. Lord Thornfield's face had gone the colour of beetroot. Thomas impossibly smiled wider. "Here we are indeed," he murmured. The rest of dinner passed in a haze of stilted conversation and barely veiled tension. Lucille pushed food around her plate, hyper-aware of every move the Duke made across from her. The way he cut his pheasant with surgical precision, the way he lifted his wine glass, long fingers curling around the stem. The way his attention kept drifting back to her, like she was magnetic north and he couldn't help his trajectory. It was infuriating. When the final course was cleared, Lucille excused herself with a practiced curtsy that contained not an ounce of genuine respect. She needed air. Space. Anything to escape the oppressive weight of Thomas Volkov's presence. She made it to the corridor before she heard his footsteps behind her. "Running away, Miss Thornfield?" Lucille spun, her skirts swirling around her ankles. Thomas stood 5 paces back, hands clasped behind him, looking every inch the aristocratic predator. "Following me, Your Grace," she countered. "How very ungentlemanly." "I never claimed to be a gentleman." He took a step closer, then another. "You insulted me at your father's table. You deserved it. Perhaps." Another step. The corridor suddenly felt narrow, suffocating. "But no one speaks to me that way." "Then consider it a learning experience." Lucille lifted her chin, refusing to retreat. "Not everyone will bow to your title." "I don't want bowing." He stopped just outside proper distance, close enough that she could smell him. Sandalwood and rain and something darker, something that made her pulse quicken despite herself. "I want honesty." "You want obedience," Lucille corrected. "There's a difference." His eyes narrowed, studying her like she was a text written in a language he'd only just started to learn. "What makes you think you know what I want?" "Because men like you are easy to read." The words came out sharper than she intended. "You walk into rooms expecting worship. You speak expecting agreement. You exist expecting the world to rearrange itself for your convenience." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "And women like you?" he asked softly. "What do they expect?" "Nothing," Lucille said, "which is why we're never disappointed." The silence that followed was heavy enough to drown in. Thomas took one final step, closing the distance to something dangerous, something that made Lucille's breath catch in her throat. He was so close now she could see the faint scar cutting through his left eyebrow, could count the different shades of grey in his irises. "You're wrong about me," he said, his voice low, intimate. "But I look forward to proving it." Then he stepped back, bowed, a gesture so formal it bordered on mockery, and turned on his heel. Lucille stood frozen in the corridor, listening to his footsteps fade, feeling her heart hammer against her ribs like it was trying to escape. She didn't know what had just happened. but she knew with absolute certainty that everything had changed. Lucille didn't sleep. She lay in her four-poster bed, staring at the canopy above her, watching shadows dance across the fabric as moonlight filtered through the curtains. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw steel-grey irises and that infuriating half-smile. Heard that low voice saying, "Women like you," with something that sounded dangerously close to admiration. She hated it. Hated him. Hated the way her pulse had jumped when he'd stepped too close. Hated the heat that had crawled up her spine. Hated the fact that she was lying here at 4 in the morning, thinking about a man she'd known for exactly 3 hours. When dawn finally broke, Lucille gave up on sleep entirely. She dressed herself, no lady's maid, not yet, the house still quiet, choosing a simple day dress in pale blue muslin. She braided her hair herself, fingers working through the dark strands with practiced efficiency, and slipped downstairs. The manor was still. Servants moved like ghosts through distant corridors, preparing for the day. Lucille made her way to the morning room, craving tea and solitude in equal measure. She got neither. Thomas Volkov sat in her father's favorite chair, reading yesterday's newspaper, looking like he'd been there for hours. He'd traded his formal dinner attire for riding clothes, buckskin breeches, tall black boots, a white shirt open at the collar, revealing a triangle of tanned skin. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, like he'd ridden hard and hadn't bothered with a mirror. He looked up when she entered, and his expression shifted into something that might have been amusement. "Good morning, Miss Thornfield." Lucille froze in the doorway. "What are you doing here?" "Waiting for you." He folded the newspaper with deliberate care, setting it aside. "Your father invited me to stay the night. I accepted." Of course he did. Lucille moved to the tea service, needing something to do with her hands. She poured with exaggerated focus, aware of his gaze tracking her every movement. "How generous of you to accept. I'm sure your own estate pales in comparison to our humble manor." "Your sarcasm needs work," Thomas observed. "It's too obvious." "And your arrogance needs work," Lucille shot back, stirring honey into her tea. "Though I suspect that ship has sailed." He laughed, that same low sound that had haunted her all night. "You really can't help yourself, can you?" "Neither can you, apparently." Lucille turned, cup cradled in both hands, and met his gaze head-on. "What do you want, Your Grace?" "Thomas." "Excuse me?" "Call me Thomas." He stood, unfolding from the chair with liquid grace. "If we're going to despise each other, we might as well be on first-name terms. I don't despise you." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Liar. He crossed the room, stopping just shy of improper distance. Again. "You despised me the moment I walked through that door." "You're very perceptive. I'm very bored." The admission came out flat, honest. "London is insufferable. The season is torture. Every conversation is the same. Every face is the same. Every woman is the same," Lucille finished. "Poor Duke. How terrible to be so desired." "Desired for my title," Thomas corrected. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his skin. "Not for myself." Something in his voice made Lucille pause. She studied him over the rim of her teacup, really looked at him. Saw the shadows beneath his eyes that matched her own. Saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched behind his back, like he was physically restraining himself. "And that matters to you?" she asked quietly. "Shouldn't it?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Lucille set her teacup down on the nearest table. "Most men in your position would consider it a blessing, to be wanted, regardless of reason. I'm not most men." "No," Lucille agreed. "You're worse." His eyes flashed. "Worse how?" "You're aware." The words came out before she could stop them. "You know exactly what you are, and what you represent, and you hate it. But you wear your title anyway like armor, because without it you'd have to figure out who you actually are beneath all that aristocratic posturing." The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas stared at her like she'd just spoken in tongues. His expression cycled through shock, anger, and something else. Something raw and exposed that disappeared so quickly, Lucille almost thought she'd imagined it. "You don't know anything about me," he said finally, his voice dangerously soft. "I know enough." Lucille crossed her arms, a shield against the sudden intensity radiating from him. "I know you showed up here uninvited, playing whatever game you're playing with my father. I know you antagonize people because it's easier than letting them close. I know—" "Stop." The command cut through the air like a blade. Lucille stopped. Thomas took a step back, then another, creating distance. He ran a hand through his hair, disrupting the dark waves, and when he looked at her again, his expression had shuttered closed. The mask was back, the arrogant duke, the untouchable aristocrat. "Your father wants to discuss business with me," he said, his tone formal, distant. "A potential investment. That's why I'm here." Business. Lucille didn't bother hiding her skepticism. How convenient. "Life rarely is, Miss Thornfield." He turned to leave, but Lucille's voice stopped him. "Why did you really come to dinner last night?" Thomas paused in the doorway, his back to her. For a long moment he didn't move, didn't speak. Then, without turning around, "Because I heard Lord Thornfield had a daughter who'd rejected 3 marriage proposals in a single season, and I wanted to meet the woman brave enough, or foolish enough, to say no." He left before Lucille could form a response. She stood alone in the morning room, her tea going cold, her mind racing. Brave enough or foolish enough to say no? She'd rejected those proposals because none of them had been real. They'd wanted her father's connections, her family's name, the dowry that came with marrying a Thornfield. Not her. Never her. But Thomas Volkov didn't need any of those things. So what exactly did he want? The rest of the morning passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Lucille helped her mother oversee the household, approved menus, responded to correspondence. But her mind kept drifting to the man currently sequestered in her father's study, discussing business like he belonged there. By afternoon, she couldn't stand it anymore. Lucille found herself in the library, her refuge, her sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with leather-bound volumes, a window seat overlooking the garden, the smell of old paper and possibility. She curled into her favorite spot with a copy of Pride and Prejudice, though the words might as well have been Greek, for all she absorbed them. "Austin." Lucille jerked her head up. Thomas stood in the doorway, jacket discarded, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He looked different, less polished, more human. "I didn't hear you come in," Lucille said, closing the book. "You were concentrating." He moved into the library like he owned it, scanning the shelves with genuine interest. "What do you think of it?" "Of what?" "Pride and Prejudice." He pulled a volume from a nearby shelf, examining the spine. "Personally, I think Darcy gets too much credit. He's an arrogant fool for most of the book." Lucille blinked. "You've read Jane Austen. Why do you sound so surprised?" "Because you're a man?" His mouth quirked. "A duke? A Russian immigrant who should stick to Tolstoy and vodka." Heat flooded Lucille's cheeks. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did." But there was no anger in his voice, just amusement. "I read everything, Miss Thornfield. It's one of my few redeeming qualities." He settled into the chair across from her window seat, stretching his long legs out in front of him. The informality of it should have been scandalous. Instead, it felt strangely natural. "What's your favorite?" Lucille asked before she could stop herself. "Book?" "Yes." Thomas considered this, his expression thoughtful. "Wuthering Heights." "Really?" Lucille couldn't hide her surprise. "That's dark. It's honest." He met her gaze, something fierce burning in those grey eyes. All that passion and obsession and complete inability to simply talk to each other. It's the most realistic love story ever written. "That's not love," Lucille argued. "That's destruction." "Sometimes they're the same thing." The words settled between them like a challenge. Lucille set her book aside carefully, deliberately. "Is that what you believe? That love destroys?" "I believe love makes fools of us all." Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, suddenly intense. "We lie to ourselves, tell ourselves we're above it, that we're too rational, too careful, too smart to fall. And then someone walks into a dining room and ruins everything." Lucille's breath caught. "Someone walks into a dining room and ruins everything. Is that what happened to you?" she whispered. Thomas held her gaze for a heartbeat. 2. 3. Then he stood abruptly, breaking the spell. "Your father wants to see you in his study." He left without another word, leaving Lucille alone with her racing heart and the terrifying realization that she was in serious, serious trouble. Lucille's father sat behind his mahogany desk like a judge delivering a sentence. The study smelled of cigar smoke and leather, masculine and oppressive. Thomas stood by the window, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Lucille stepped inside, her heart hammering. "You wanted to see me, Father?" Lord Thornfield didn't waste time on pleasantries. "The Duke of Ashford has made an offer." The room tilted. "An offer," Lucille repeated slowly, buying time, buying space to think. "For your hand," her father continued, his tone brisk, businesslike. "He's proposed a marriage contract. Quite generous terms, actually. He would settle a substantial sum on you, ensure your comfort." "No." The word cut through the study like a gunshot. Lord Thornfield's expression hardened. "Lucille, no," she repeated, louder now. Her gaze snapped to Thomas, who hadn't moved, hadn't reacted. "You can't be serious." "I'm always serious about business," Thomas said quietly. "Business?" The word came out strangled. "That's what this is to you? A transaction? What else would it be?" He turned from the window, and the afternoon light caught his face, throwing half of it into shadow. "We're not children playing at romance, Miss Thornfield. This is reality. You need a marriage that gives you freedom. I need a wife who won't bore me to death. It's practical." Lucille laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Practical, of course. How foolish of me to expect anything else from the great Duke of Ashford." Her father stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "Lucille, you will show respect." "Respect?" She whirled on him. "For what? For being sold like livestock? For being treated like another line item in a business contract?" "This is an incredible opportunity," Lord Thornfield insisted, his face reddening. "Do you understand what his title means, what his wealth means? You would never want for anything except love, except choice, except being treated like an actual human being instead of a convenient solution to whatever problem he's trying to solve." Lucille's chest heaved, her vision blurred. She could feel tears threatening, hot and furious behind her eyes, but she'd be damned if she cried in front of them. "You rejected 3 proposals," her father said, his voice dropping to something colder, harder. 3 perfectly acceptable men. Your mother and I have been patient, but that patience has limits. You're 23, Lucille. Time is not your friend. So you're giving me away to the first Duke who asks? I'm giving you a chance at a life most women only dream of. "I don't want dreams," Lucille said, her voice breaking despite her best efforts. "I want to be seen, I want to be known, I want—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "It doesn't matter what I want, does it?" The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas finally moved. He crossed the study in 3 long strides and stopped in front of Lucille's father. "Give us the room." Lord Thornfield bristled. "This is my study. Now." The command in his voice left no room for argument. After a tense moment, Lord Thornfield stalked out, slamming the door behind him. Lucille and Thomas stood in the echoing quiet, 5 feet apart, an ocean of unspoken words between them. "You should have said no," Lucille whispered. "I know." "Then why didn't you?" Thomas's jaw worked. "Because I'm a selfish bastard who saw something he wanted and decided to take it. I'm not a thing to be taken. I know that too." He moved closer, slow, careful, like approaching a wounded animal. "Lucille, look at me." She didn't want to. Looking at him hurt, but she did anyway, lifting her chin, meeting those impossible grey eyes. "I'm not asking you to love me," Thomas said quietly. "I'm asking you to marry me. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes." He reached out, then stopped, his hand hovering in the space between them. "Love is complicated. Marriage can be simple. A partnership, an alliance. You get your freedom. My name protects you. My wealth supports you. You can do whatever you want, read whatever you want, be whatever you want, and I get—" "What?" Lucille demanded. "What do you get?" His hand dropped. "Honesty. Someone who sees through the title to the man underneath. Someone who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm being an arrogant fool." A pause. "Someone like you." Lucille's breath shuddered out. "You don't know me. I want to." 3 words, simple, devastating. "That's not enough," Lucille managed. "Maybe not." Thomas stepped back, creating distance, giving her room to breathe. "But it's more than most marriages start with, and it's honest. I won't lie to you, Lucille. I won't pretend this is some grand romance, but I will promise you respect, freedom, and a partnership between equals." "Equals?" Lucille laughed shakily. "You're a duke. I'm a baron's daughter. We're not equals. In the eyes of society? No. But in every way that matters?" His gaze held hers, unwavering. "Yes." Lucille turned away, moving to the window Thomas had vacated. The garden stretched below, precise and manicured and completely controlled, like her life, like her future. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked without turning around. 3 days. 3 days to choose between impossible options, to marry a man she barely knew for practical reasons that made perfect sense and absolutely none at all. To say yes to freedom, bought with a ring and a contract. Or to say no and face whatever her father would arrange instead. What if I refuse? The question came out smaller than she intended. Behind her she heard Thomas move, felt him stop just behind her, close enough that his presence was a physical thing against her back. "Then I leave," he said quietly, "and you'll never see me again." Something in Lucille's chest constricted painfully. She closed her eyes, hating herself for what she was about to say. "I need to think." "Of course." His footsteps retreated. The door opened, closed, and Lucille was alone with the weight of a choice that felt like drowning and flying all at once. That night, Lucille couldn't face dinner. She sent word that she had a headache, not entirely untrue, and stayed in her room. A maid brought soup and tea, both of which went cold while Lucille stared at the ceiling. Marriage to Thomas Volkov, the Duke of Ashford. A man who looked at her like she was a puzzle and a prize and something dangerously close to precious. She should say no, should tell him to go to hell, should demand the love story she'd always secretly wanted, the romance that swept her off her feet and made sense of this confusing, complicated world. But I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to marry me. The honesty of it cut deeper than any pretty lie could have. He wasn't offering her poetry or passion. He was offering her reality, a partnership, respect, freedom. How many women could say that about their marriages? Around midnight, Lucille gave up on sleep entirely. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and slipped out of her room, padding down the dark hallway in bare feet. She needed air, space, somewhere to think that didn't smell like roses and feel like a cage. She made it to the library before she realized she wasn't alone. Thomas sat in the dark, illuminated only by moonlight streaming through the tall windows. He'd discarded his jacket again, his shirt open at the collar, his hair disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it. A bottle of whiskey sat on the table beside him, half empty. He looked up when she entered, but didn't seem surprised to see her. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice rough. "Could you?" "No." Lucille moved into the library, drawn despite herself. She curled into her window seat, tucking her feet beneath her, and studied him across the darkness. "Why me?" she asked finally. "Really? Not the business reasons or the practical reasons? Why me?" Thomas was quiet for so long, Lucille thought he might not answer. Then, "Because you looked at me like I was just a man." The simplicity of it stole her breath. "In that dining room," he continued, staring at the whiskey glass in his hand, "when you insulted me, when you challenged me, when you refused to be impressed by my title or my wealth or any of the things that usually work, you weren't seeing the Duke of Ashford. You were seeing Thomas Volkov, just me. And no one has done that in so long I'd forgotten what it felt like." Lucille's throat tightened. "That's not a reason to marry someone." "Isn't it?" He finally looked at her, and the raw vulnerability in his expression made her chest ache. "I'm so tired, Lucille. Tired of performing. Tired of being whatever everyone needs me to be. Tired of being alone in rooms full of people who want something from me." He set the glass down carefully. "And then you walked into my line of sight and didn't want anything. And I thought, maybe this could be different." "You don't even know me," Lucille whispered. "So let me learn." The words hung in the moonlit space between them. "What if it's a disaster?" Lucille asked. "What if we hate each other?" "We already hate each other." Thomas's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile. "At least it won't be boring." Despite everything, Lucille laughed. It came out watery, shaky, but real. "You're insane," she said. "Probably." He stood, unfolding from the chair, and crossed to her window seat. He held out his hand, an offering, not a demand. "Marry me, Lucille Thornfield. Not because you have to, not because your father wants you to. but because somewhere in the chaos of the last 24 hours, you've realized the same thing I have. What's that? His eyes held hers, steady and sure and terrifying in their intensity. That this, whatever this is, it's worth finding out. Lucille stared at his outstretched hand, at the possibility it represented, at the risk and the reward and the complete unknown of what came next. She thought about freedom, about partnership, about a man who'd read Jane Austen and admitted to being tired and looked at her like she mattered. She thought about saying no and wondering forever what might have been. And then, before she could talk herself out of it, Lucille placed her hand in his. 3 conditions, she said. Thomas's fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. Name them. 1. I will not be a trophy wife. I want purpose. Work. Something that matters. Agreed. 2. You will never lie to me, even if the truth is ugly, especially then. Agreed. 3. Lucille took a breath. If either of us falls in love with someone else, we talk about it. We face it honestly. We don't stay in a marriage that makes us miserable. Something flickered in Thomas's expression. Pain, maybe, or fear, but he nodded. Agreed. Then yes, Lucille whispered, I'll marry you. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Thomas pulled her to her feet, drawing her close, not improper, not sexual, just close. His forehead dropped to rest against hers, and they stood there in the moonlight, breathing the same air, balanced on the edge of something neither of them fully understood. Thank you, he murmured. Lucille's hand came up to rest against his chest, feeling his heartbeat through the fine linen of his shirt. It was racing, matching hers. Don't make me regret this, she said. I'll try not to. And in that moment, standing in a dark library with moonlight painting them both silver, Lucille thought maybe, just maybe, this impossible, practical, completely insane arrangement might actually work. Morning arrived too quickly and not fast enough. Lucille woke to pale sunlight streaming through her curtains and the surreal realization that she'd agreed to marry a duke she'd known for exactly 2 days. Her maid, Bess, entered with hot water and raised eyebrows. Your father requests your presence at breakfast, miss. Lucille's stomach dropped. All of us? All of you. Bess laid out a dress, hunter green with delicate embroidery at the sleeves. He seemed pleased. Of course he did. Lucille dressed mechanically, her mind elsewhere. What had she done? What had possessed her to say yes in the moonlit haze of last night, with Thomas's hand warm around hers and his voice soft with something that sounded dangerously like hope? But then she remembered his words. Someone who sees through the title to the man underneath. She remembered the exhaustion in his eyes, the vulnerability he'd shown her. She remembered feeling for the first time in her life like someone actually understood the cage she'd been living in. And she thought, maybe this isn't a mistake. Maybe. Breakfast was a production. Her father presided over the table like a king. Her mother radiated approval, and Timothy looked thoroughly confused. Thomas sat beside Lucille's father, immaculately dressed in a charcoal morning coat, his expression giving away absolutely nothing. But when Lucille entered and his gaze found hers, something in his shoulders relaxed. Good morning, Miss Thornfield, he said formally. Your Grace, Lucille replied, settling into her seat. Her father cleared his throat, setting down his newspaper with exaggerated care. The Duke and I have finalized the marriage contract, pending your continued agreement, of course. All eyes turned to Lucille. She reached for her teacup, using the motion to steady her hands. I'd like to review it. Her mother gasped softly. Lucille, that's hardly appropriate, Thomas interrupted smoothly. On the contrary, Lady Thornfield, I'd be disappointed if my future wife didn't ensure her interests were protected. He turned to Lucille. I had copies prepared for your review. Shall we discuss them in the library after breakfast? The formality of it all felt absurd. They were negotiating a marriage like a business merger, complete with contracts and clauses and lawyer-approved language. But maybe that's exactly what it was. Maybe honesty meant treating this like the transaction it was, instead of dressing it up in ribbons and pretending it was something else. That would be acceptable, Lucille said. Timothy kicked her under the table. Lucille kicked back. Breakfast dragged. Lucille pushed food around her plate while her parents discussed wedding timelines and guest lists and all the minutiae that apparently accompanied aristocratic marriages. Thomas contributed when necessary, his responses measured and appropriate. But Lucille could feel his attention on her, could sense the question beneath every word. "Are you sure?" She wasn't. But she also wasn't ready to run. The library felt different in daylight, less intimate, more businesslike. Thomas closed the door behind them and immediately moved to the desk, where 3 bound documents waited. "These are yours," he said, gesturing to them. "The marriage contract, the settlement terms, and the provisions for separate property. Everything my solicitor drafted. Everything your father agreed to." Lucille picked up the first document, scanning the dense legal language. It was comprehensive, terrifyingly so. Details about her dowry, his contributions, living arrangements, financial protections. "Page 7, Thomas said quietly. Lucille flipped to it and froze. "The wife shall maintain complete control over her own finances, including any inheritance, gifts, or income generated through her own endeavors. The husband shall have no claim to said finances without express written permission." She looked up. "This is unusual. It's necessary." Thomas leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "I told you I wanted a partnership. That means you need independence. Real independence, not just the illusion of it." Lucille turned back to the contract, continuing to read. With each page, her surprise grew. Everything he'd promised was there in black ink. Separate bedrooms if she wanted them, freedom to pursue her own interests, protection from debt in his name, even a clause that allowed her to travel without his explicit permission. "Why?" she asked finally, setting the papers down. "Why give me all this? Most men would never—" "I'm not most men." Thomas pushed off the desk, moving to stand before her. "And I'm not interested in owning you, Lucille. I'm interested in knowing you. There's a difference. But if you're giving me all this freedom, what do you get?" His expression shifted, becoming something unreadable. "You, as you are. Not some sanitized, acceptable version society expects. Just you." Lucille's breath caught. "And if you decide 10 years from now that this arrangement isn't working," she asked, "that you want something different, then we renegotiate." He said it simply, like it was obvious. "Like I said, partnership. That means honest conversations even when they're difficult." Lucille turned away, moving to the window Thomas had vacated. The garden looked different now, less like a cage, more like possibility. "Everyone will think you're mad. Let them. They'll say you married beneath you. Let them. They'll wonder what's wrong with you, choosing a baron's daughter with a reputation for being difficult when you could have anyone." "Lucille." Thomas's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. She turned to find him right behind her, close enough to touch, but not touching. "Do you want to marry me?" Such a simple question, such an impossible answer. "I don't know," Lucille admitted. "I barely know you. This could be a disaster. We could be completely incompatible." We could, Thomas agreed. "Or we could be exactly what the other needs." He held her gaze, steady and sure. "I can't promise you love. I can't promise you happiness. But I can promise you honesty, respect, and freedom. Is that enough?" Lucille thought about the 3 marriage proposals she'd rejected, about men who'd wanted her father's money, her family's connections, her body in their bed, and her silence at their table. About the life she'd been headed toward. Dutiful daughter, then dutiful wife, then dutiful mother, each role more suffocating than the last. And she thought about Thomas in the moonlight, admitting he was tired. Thomas challenging her in the dining room, not threatened by her opinions but intrigued by them. Thomas offering her contracts that protected her independence instead of stripping it away. "It's enough," she said quietly. "It has to be." Something in Thomas's expression eased, relief maybe, or gratitude. "Then we have an agreement." He held out his hand, formal, businesslike. Lucille looked at it for a long moment, at the choice it represented, at the terrifying leap of faith it required. Then she took it. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, and he lifted her hand to his lips. The kiss he pressed to her knuckles was brief, chaste, appropriate. But the way his eyes held hers over their joined hands was anything but. The next hours passed in a blur. Lucille's mother descended with fabric samples and guest lists and opinions about everything from flowers to wedding breakfast menus. Her father closeted himself with Thomas again, presumably discussing finances. Timothy found Lucille in her room and demanded to know if she'd lost her mind. Probably, Lucille admitted, staring at herself in her mirror. Her reflection looked the same. Same dark hair, same green eyes, same sharp features, but something had shifted beneath her skin, some fundamental change she couldn't name. "He's a duke," Timothy said, pacing her room like a caged animal. "He could have anyone. Why you?" "Gee, thank you for that vote of confidence. You know what I mean." Her brother stopped, turning to face her. "This is strange, Lucille. The timing, the rush, the way father agreed so quickly. It's not normal." "When has anything about our family been normal?" Timothy's expression softened. "Are you sure about this?" Lucille thought about lying, about giving him the answer he wanted to hear, that she was certain, confident, that this was absolutely the right choice. But Thomas had asked for honesty. Maybe she owed her brother the same. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not sure, but I'm more sure of this than I was of any other option." She met Timothy's gaze. "He's giving me freedom, Tim. Real freedom." How many women can say that about their marriages? Freedom isn't everything. Maybe not, but it's more than I had yesterday. Timothy sighed, running a hand through his hair. A gesture so similar to Thomas's, it made Lucille smile despite herself. "Just be careful. Promise me." "I promise." He hugged her then, quick and fierce, before retreating to whatever brothers did when their sisters made questionable life choices. Lucille stood alone in her room, watching afternoon light paint patterns across the floor, and wondered what came next. The answer came at dinner. They were halfway through the main course when Thomas set down his fork and cleared his throat. "I should return to Ashford House tomorrow. There are arrangements to be made before the wedding. 3 weeks. They'd agreed on 3 weeks, enough time for banns to be read and guests to be invited, but not so long that Lucille could talk herself out of it. "Will you be back before then?" Lady Thornfield asked, ever the social planner. "Once." Thomas's gaze found Lucille's across the table. "Next week. I'll return next week." To make sure she hadn't changed her mind, Lucille realized, to give her an escape route if she needed one. "I'll look forward to it," she said, surprised to find she meant it. After dinner, as the family dispersed and servants cleared the table, Thomas caught Lucille's elbow gently. "Walk with me?" It wasn't really a question. They stepped out into the garden, the evening air cool and fragrant with roses. Lanterns had been lit along the paths, casting everything in warm, flickering light. Lucille wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, hyper-aware of Thomas beside her, his height, his presence, the careful distance he maintained. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly. "Terrified," Lucille admitted. "Good." At her sharp look, he smiled. "Fear means you're taking this seriously, that you understand what we're committing to." 3 weeks, Lucille said. "We'll be married in 3 weeks, and we barely know each other. Then tell me something." "What?" "Anything." Thomas stopped walking, turning to face her fully. In the lantern light, his features were softened, made almost gentle. "Tell me something true. Something you don't tell anyone else." Lucille's first instinct was to deflect, to offer something safe and meaningless. But then she remembered. Honesty. That's what this is built on. "I'm afraid I'll disappoint you," she said. "That you'll realize I'm not whatever you think I am, and you'll regret this." Thomas was quiet for a moment, then, "I'm afraid you'll realize I'm exactly what you think I am. Arrogant, difficult, impossible to live with. And you'll regret this." The honesty of it stole her breath. "I guess we're both taking a risk," Lucille managed. "I guess we are." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered for just a moment, warm against her temple. "But I've always been good at risks." "Have you?" Lucille's voice came out softer than intended. "Made my fortune on them." His hand dropped, but he didn't step back. "Built my reputation on them." "Why should marriage be any different?" "Because marriage isn't business." "No," Thomas agreed. "It's much more important than that." They stood there in the garden, surrounded by roses and lantern light, balanced on the precipice of something that felt monumental and terrifying and strangely inevitable. "I should go," Thomas said finally. "Early start tomorrow." "Yes, of course." But neither of them moved. "Lucille," he said, And the way he said her name like it was something precious made her chest ache. Thank you for saying yes, for giving this a chance, for what? For seeing me. Before she could respond, he bowed formally and walked away, leaving Lucille standing alone in the garden with her racing heart and the growing, terrifying realization that this practical, sensible arrangement might already be something else entirely. The manor felt emptier after Thomas left. Lucille told herself it was ridiculous. He'd only been there 3 days, hardly enough time to leave an impression on the house itself. But his absence echoed through the corridors anyway, a silence that felt different from the usual quiet. She threw herself into wedding preparations with a determination that bordered on manic. Fabric selections, guest lists, menu planning, all the tedious details her mother lived for and Lucille had always avoided. But now she welcomed the distraction, welcomed anything that kept her from thinking too hard about what she'd agreed to. 3 weeks had seemed like plenty of time when Thomas suggested it. Now it felt both impossibly far away and terrifyingly close. On the 3rd day after his departure, a package arrived. Lucille found it on her writing desk when she returned from an exhausting morning of dress fittings, a small wooden box, beautifully carved, with a note tucked beneath the ribbon. She recognized Thomas's handwriting immediately, bold, slanted, confident. For the hours between. Lucille's fingers trembled as she opened the box. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a book. But not just any book. A first edition of Villette by Charlotte Brontë, its leather binding pristine, its pages crisp and unread. Her breath caught. She'd mentioned it once in passing during one of their late-night library conversations. Had said she'd been searching for a copy for months, that it was nearly impossible to find. He'd remembered. Lucille sank into her chair, holding the book like it might disappear if she loosened her grip. She opened the front cover carefully and found another note, this one longer. Lucille, I'm not a romantic. You know this already. I won't pretend to be something I'm not, won't dress up this arrangement in pretty lies, but I meant what I said. I want to know you. And if that means learning what books make you light up, what arguments make you passionate, what silences make you comfortable, then that's what I'll do. This is not a grand gesture. This is me, trying. Read this and think of me. Or don't. And think of me anyway. Thomas Lucille read the note 3 times, then a 4th. Each time, something in her chest tightened and released, like a breath she'd been holding without realizing. He'd signed it Thomas. Not the Duke of Ashford, not Your Grace, just him. She pressed the note to her chest and allowed herself for just a moment to wonder if maybe this impossible arrangement might actually become something real. The week crawled by with agonizing slowness. Lucille read Villette in stolen moments, each page a reminder of Thomas's attention to detail, his careful observation. She caught herself wondering what he was doing at Ashford House, whether he thought of her, whether he was as nervous as she was. Her mother noticed her distraction. "You're glowing," Lady Margaret observed over tea, her tone pleased. "Marriage suits you already." "I'm not married yet," Lucille pointed out. "No, but you will be." Her mother set down her teacup with delicate precision. "The Duke of Ashford, Lucille. Do you understand what this means for our family? Do you understand that I barely understand what it means for me?" But Lucille just smiled and nodded and let her mother plan, because it was easier than explaining that this wasn't about family advancement or social climbing. It was about a man who'd looked at her in a moonlit library and admitted he was tired. A man who'd given her contracts that protected her freedom instead of stripping it away. A man who'd sent her a book because he'd listened to her. On the 6th day, Timothy found her in the garden, staring at nothing. "You're different," he said, settling onto the bench beside her. "Am I? You smile more, or maybe you just smile differently, like you're thinking about something secret." Lucille glanced at her brother. He'd always been perceptive, reading people's expressions the way she read books. "Maybe I am. Is it him?" She didn't need to ask who him was. Maybe. Timothy was quiet for a moment, studying the rose bushes with exaggerated interest. Father's pleased with himself. Keeps talking about business opportunities with the Duke's connections. Lucille's jaw tightened. "Of course he does. But I don't think that's why the Duke wants to marry you." She turned to face him fully. "No? No. Timothy met her gaze, his expression serious beyond his 19 years. "I saw the way he looked at you at dinner. Like you were a puzzle he actually wanted to solve, not just a picture to hang on his wall. That's," Lucille searched for words, "surprisingly insightful. I have my moments." He bumped her shoulder with his. "Just promise me something." "What?" "If he hurts you, title or not, duke or not, I'll challenge him to a duel." Lucille laughed, the sound bright and genuine. "You can't even shoot straight." "Then I'll challenge him to a very stern conversation." "My hero." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching clouds drift across the sky, and Lucille thought, "Whatever happens with Thomas, at least I have this. At least I have people who see me." The seventh day arrived with grey skies and the promise of rain. Lucille woke feeling restless, anxious, like her skin was too tight for her body. Thomas was supposed to return today. Would return today, according to the brief note he'd sent yesterday. She changed dresses 3 times before settling on pale lavender muslin with tiny embroidered flowers. Told herself she wasn't trying to impress him. Told herself the flutter in her stomach was just nerves, nothing more. Told herself she was a terrible liar. By afternoon, when the rain had started in earnest and there was still no sign of him, Lucille's anxiety had morphed into something sharper. What if he'd changed his mind? What if he'd returned to London and realized this whole thing was madness? What if... The door to the morning room opened. Thomas stood in the doorway, soaked to the bone, his dark hair plastered to his skull, his coat dripping puddles onto the pristine floor, his boots caked with mud. He looked like he'd ridden through hell to get here. He looked perfect. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. The roads were worse than expected. "I should have sent word, but I wanted..." He stopped, his gaze finally focusing on her. Lucille. Just her name. But the way he said it made her heart stutter. Lucille set down her book carefully and stood. "You're drenched." Astute observation. "You should change before you catch pneumonia." Probably. But he didn't move, just stood there staring at her like she was water, and he'd been walking through desert for days. The tension in the room was thick enough to drown in. "I missed you," Thomas said suddenly, the words tumbling out rough and unpolished. "I know I shouldn't have. I know it's absurd to miss someone after a week, someone I barely know. But I did. I missed arguing with you. I missed the way you look at me like you're trying to figure out if I'm brilliant or insane. I missed..." Lucille crossed the room in 3 strides and kissed him. She didn't plan it, didn't think about it. Just acted on the impulse that had been building for 7 days, rising like floodwater behind a dam until it finally, inevitably broke. For a heartbeat, Thomas was frozen. Then his hands came up, one cupping the back of her head, the other settling at her waist, and he kissed her back. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't tentative. It was 7 days of tension and uncertainty and want crashing together all at once. His mouth was warm despite the cold rain clinging to him, insistent, demanding. Lucille's fingers tangled in his wet hair, pulling him closer, closer, until there was no space left between them. He tasted like rain and possibility. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed, his expression almost pained. "Lucille," he whispered, "we shouldn't. This wasn't supposed to..." "I know." Her hands were still in his hair, refusing to let go. "I know what this was supposed to be. Practical, a partnership. It's not just anything anymore, is it?" The question hung between them, terrifying in its honesty. "No," Lucille admitted. "It's not." Thomas pulled back just enough to see her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with devastating gentleness. "I'm going to ruin you. I'm going to let you." His laugh was rough, almost broken. "We're both idiots." "Probably." He kissed her again, softer this time, like he was memorizing the shape of her mouth, the taste of her, the way she sighed against him. Then he stepped back, creating necessary distance, his hands dropping to his sides, even though his fingers curled into fists like he was physically restraining himself from reaching for her again. "I should change," he said, his voice hoarse. "You should. And we should talk. About this. About what it means. We should." But neither of them moved, locked in place by the weight of what had just shifted between them. The practical arrangement had become something else, something neither of them had planned for, and both of them wanted, desperately. 2 weeks, Thomas said finally. In 2 weeks, you'll be my wife. I know. And then... He stopped, swallowed hard. And then we'll figure out what this is. Together. Together, Lucille echoed. He left then, dripping water and tracking mud, leaving Lucille alone in the morning room with her racing heart and the taste of him still on her lips. She touched her mouth, feeling the slight tenderness there, and thought, "Oh, I'm in so much trouble." That night, after dinner had been endured and her family had retired, Lucille found Thomas in the library. He changed into dry clothes, his hair still damp, but no longer plastered to his skull. He stood by the window, staring out at the rain-soaked garden, holding a glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking. "Couldn't sleep?" Lucille asked from the doorway. He turned, and the expression on his face was raw, unguarded. "I keep thinking about this afternoon." "So do I." "Lucille." Her name was part warning, part plea. "We need to be smart about this." "Why?" She moved into the library, closing the door behind her. "Why do we need to be smart? We're already getting married." "What difference does it make if there's feelings?" Thomas finished. "You can say it. There are feelings." "Are there?" Lucille challenged. "On your side?" He set the whiskey glass down with exaggerated care, like he didn't trust himself with it. "Yes." The single word landed like thunder. "Since when?" Lucille whispered. "Since you insulted me at dinner, and I realized I wanted nothing more than to make you keep talking. Since you challenged every assumption I'd made about marriage and partnership and what I deserved. Since..." He stopped, ran a hand through his hair. "Lucille, I proposed because I thought we could have something practical and beneficial. A partnership. But somewhere between that first night and now, it stopped being practical and started being dangerous. Necessary." His gaze held hers, intense and unwavering. "You're necessary, and I don't know what to do with that." Lucille's breath shuddered out. She crossed the library slowly, giving him time to retreat if he wanted. He didn't. She stopped just in front of him, close enough to feel his warmth, close enough to see the rapid pulse at his throat. "What if we just let it be what it is?" she asked quietly. "What if we stop trying to define it or control it or fit it into neat boxes? What if we just feel?" Thomas's hand came up, cupping her face with a gentleness that made her chest ache. "That's terrifying." "I know. You could destroy me, Lucille Thornfield. You could destroy me too." His thumb traced her lower lip, a touch so light it was almost imaginary. "Then I suppose we'll have to be careful with each other." "Very careful," Lucille agreed. He leaned down, his lips barely brushing hers. Not quite a kiss, more like a promise. 2 weeks, he murmured against her mouth. "And then you're mine." 2 weeks, Lucille echoed. "And then you're mine too." The kiss that followed was slow, deep, deliberate. Not the desperate collision of this afternoon, but something richer, more intentional. Like they were both acknowledging what this was, what it was becoming, and choosing it anyway. When they finally pulled apart, Thomas kept her close, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on top of her head. "Stay with me," Lucille whispered. "Just for tonight. Not like that. Just stay." She felt him tense, felt him war with propriety and desire and all the rules they were already bending. Then he relaxed, pressing a kiss to her hair. "All right." They settled onto the sofa, Lucille tucked against his side, his arm around her shoulders. Outside, rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows. Inside, wrapped in darkness and possibility, they sat in silence that felt like communication, comfort that felt like home. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, with Thomas's steady heartbeat beneath her ear, Lucille finally understood what she'd gotten herself into. This wasn't a practical arrangement anymore. This was falling, and she didn't want to stop. Lucille woke to sunlight streaming through library windows and her mother's horrified gasp. She jolted upright, momentarily disoriented. Thomas stirred beside her, his arms still draped over her shoulders from where they'd fallen asleep on the sofa. They were both fully dressed. Nothing improper had occurred, but the optics. Lucille Josephine Thornfield. Lady Margaret stood in the doorway, her face cycling through shock, anger, and something that might have been panic. Behind her, a maid clutched a breakfast tray, eyes wide as saucers. Thomas was on his feet instantly, positioning himself slightly in front of Lucille. Lady Thornfield, this isn't what it looks like. Lucille's mother laughed, the sound brittle and sharp. My daughter unchaperoned, asleep with a man, duke or not, in a compromising position. Oh, I think it's exactly what it looks like. Mother. Nothing happened, Lucille said, standing on shaky legs. Her dress was wrinkled, her hair half fallen from its pins, and she could feel a crease on her cheek from where she'd been pressed against Thomas's coat. We just talked and fell asleep, that's all. That's all? Lady Margaret's voice rose. Do you have any idea what the servants will say? What society will make of this if word gets out? Then ensure word doesn't get out, Thomas said calmly, though Lucille could hear the steel beneath his words. Your staff is loyal, I presume. Lady Margaret turned her formidable glare on him. My staff gossips like everyone else's staff, Your Grace. This will be all over the county by afternoon tea. Then we move the wedding up, Thomas said simply. Silence crashed through the room. What? Lucille and her mother said in unison. Thomas turned to Lucille, his expression serious but not unkind. We were getting married in 2 weeks anyway. If there's concern about propriety, about scandal, we solve it by marrying immediately. Special license, 3 days, done. Lucille's heart hammered. 3 days. Unless you want to deal with whispers and speculation for the next fortnight. His gaze searched hers. I can have the license by tomorrow. We can marry the day after. Or we can wait and weather whatever storm is coming, your choice. Your choice. Even now, even in the midst of this disaster, he was giving her options, giving her power. Lucille looked at her mother's pinched expression, thought about the gossip that would follow them, the way every look and whisper would chip away at what little privacy they had left. Then she looked at Thomas, steady, certain, offering her a way out. That era was also a way forward. 3 days, she said. Relief flickered across his face, there and gone in an instant. 3 days, he agreed. Lady Margaret looked between them, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Finally she straightened, smoothing her skirts with shaking hands. I'll speak to your father, and the vicar, and... She pressed a hand to her forehead. 3 days. We have 3 days to plan a ducal wedding. She swept from the room, the maid scurrying after her, leaving Lucille and Thomas alone in the morning light. I'm sorry, Lucille said immediately. I shouldn't have asked you to stay. I didn't think... Stop. Thomas closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face. This isn't your fault. If anything, it's mine for agreeing, for falling asleep, for... He stopped, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. Are you all right with this? Truly? Moving the wedding up? Yes. Lucille thought about it. Thought about how 2 weeks had already felt, both too long and not long enough. Thought about how she'd fallen asleep in his arms and woken feeling safer than she had in years. Thought about the way her heart had skipped when he'd said your choice, even in crisis. Yes, she said. I'm all right with it. You're sure? I'm terrified, Lucille admitted. But I was terrified anyway. At least this way we get it over with. His laugh was rough but genuine. Such a romantic sentiment. I thought you didn't want romance. I don't. But his hands were still cradling her face, his touch impossibly gentle. I want you, there's a difference. Before Lucille could respond, he kissed her, brief, chaste, appropriate. Then he stepped back, creating proper distance. I need to return to London, get the special license, notify my solicitor, arrange transportation. His mind was already working, she could see it in his eyes. I'll be back tomorrow evening, and then the next day, we get married. He said it simply, like it wasn't the most life-altering sentence in the world. Lucille nodded, not trusting her voice. Thomas hesitated at the doorway, looking back at her. Lucille, for what it's worth, I don't regret last night. Not a second of it. Then he was gone, leaving Lucille alone in the library with sun-warmed floorboards and the echo of 3 words that changed everything. 3 days. The next 60 hours were complete chaos. Lucille's mother transformed into a military general, marshalling servants and vendors with ruthless efficiency. The wedding that was supposed to take 2 weeks to plan would now happen in 72 hours, and Lady Margaret seemed determined to make it perfect through sheer force of will. Guest lists were revised, invitations hand-delivered to those close enough to attend on short notice. The local dressmaker was summoned and practically lived at the manor, altering Lucille's wedding dress around the clock. Flowers were ordered, the church was prepared, and somewhere in all of it, Lucille lost track of herself. She went through the motions, stood for fittings, approved decisions she barely processed. But her mind was elsewhere, counting down hours until Thomas returned, until this became real and irreversible. Timothy found her on the evening before the wedding, sitting in the garden as twilight painted everything purple and gold. "Cold feet?" he asked, settling beside her on their usual bench. "Numb feet," Lucille corrected. "I can't feel anything." "That's probably shock." "Probably." They sat in silence for a while, listening to birds settle for the night, watching stars begin to emerge. "Do you love him?" Timothy asked finally. Lucille considered the question carefully. Love seemed like too simple a word for what she felt. This complicated tangle of attraction and respect, and terror and want. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But I think I could. And that's more than I had a week ago. He better treat you well." "He will." Lucille felt certain of that, at least. Whatever else Thomas was, he was honest. He'd keep his promises. He'd give her the partnership he'd offered. And maybe, if they were lucky, something more. "I'll miss having you here," Timothy said quietly. "The manner's going to be boring without you insulting everyone at dinner." Lucille's throat tightened. "I'll visit, and you'll visit us. Thomas has already said you're welcome at Ashford House any time." "He did?" "Yesterday, before he left for London. He said, and I quote, 'Your brother seems like one of the few people in your family with sense. Make sure he visits.'" Timothy grinned. "I like him more already." They sat together until full dark, not talking, just being. And Lucille thought, whatever happens tomorrow, whatever this marriage becomes, at least I'll always have this. This brother, this bench, this moment. Morning arrived too soon, and not soon enough. Lucille woke to pre-dawn light and Bess already bustling around her room, preparing the wedding dress. It was beautiful, ivory silk with delicate lace at the sleeves and neckline, simple but elegant. The kind of dress a duchess would wear. The kind of dress Lucille never imagined wearing. "You're getting married today, miss," Bess said, her voice thick with emotion. "To a duke." "I know," Lucille whispered, staring at the dress like it might come alive. The morning passed in a haze of preparation. Bath, hair, cosmetics, dress. Lucille stood like a doll while hands worked on her, transforming her into someone bridal, someone proper, someone who looked like she belonged on a duke's arm. When she finally looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. "You're beautiful," her mother said, appearing behind her reflection. Lady Margaret's eyes were damp, her expression softer than Lucille had seen in years. "My daughter, the Duchess of Ashford." "I'm not yet," Lucille pointed out. "You will be in 2 hours." Her mother placed her hands on Lucille's shoulders, meeting her gaze in the mirror. "I know we haven't always understood each other. I know I pushed when you wanted space, demanded conformity when you wanted freedom, but Lucille, I want you to be happy, truly happy. Is this what you want?" Lucille thought about Thomas in the moonlight, admitting he was tired. Thomas sending her books because he listened. Thomas giving her contracts that protected her independence. Thomas falling asleep beside her because she'd asked him to stay. "Yes," she said, "this is what I want." Lady Margaret squeezed her shoulders. "Then go get married." The church was packed. News of the rushed wedding had spread despite best efforts, and everyone within riding distance had apparently decided to attend. Lucille walked down the aisle on her father's arm, aware of every eye on her, every whispered speculation. But then she saw Thomas and everything else faded. He stood at the altar in formal black, his posture military straight, his expression serious. But when his gaze found hers, something in him softened, eased. Like the sight of her approaching was the answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask. Lucille barely heard the ceremony, barely registered the vicar's words, the traditional vows, the responses she gave automatically. She was too focused on Thomas's hands holding hers, steady and sure. Too focused on the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the room, the only person who mattered. "I do," she heard herself say. "I do," Thomas echoed, his voice low and certain. And then, "You may kiss the bride." Thomas's hands came up to frame her face, a gesture that was already becoming familiar, already felt like home. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't want. The kiss was appropriate for their audience, brief, chaste, respectful. But Lucille felt it all the way to her toes anyway, felt the promise in it, the beginning it represented. When they pulled apart, Thomas whispered against her lips, too quiet for anyone else to hear. "Hello, wife." Lucille's breath caught. "Hello, husband." They turned to face their audience as the vicar announced, "May I present the Duke and Duchess of Ashford." Applause erupted. People stood. Lucille's hand tightened on Thomas's arm, overwhelmed by the sudden reality of it all. She was married. To a duke. To Thomas. They walked down the aisle together, through a gauntlet of smiling faces and curious stares, out into afternoon sunlight that felt too bright, too real. A carriage waited. Thomas's carriage, decorated with flowers and ribbons, ready to take them to the wedding breakfast at Thornfield Manor. But before they climbed in, Thomas turned to her. "All right?" he asked quietly. Lucille looked at him, this man who was now her husband, her partner, her future, and felt fear and excitement and hope tangled together in her chest. "All right," she confirmed. He helped her into the carriage, his hand warm and steady on hers, and as they pulled away from the church, Lucille thought, "This is it, this is my life now, and I chose it. I chose him, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough." The wedding breakfast was excruciating. Lucille smiled until her face hurt, accepted congratulations from people she barely knew, endured her mother's tearful speeches and her father's self-satisfied toasts. Through it all, Thomas remained at her side, a solid, grounding presence in the chaos. His hand found hers under the table during dessert, fingers lacing together in a gesture no one else could see. Lucille squeezed back, grateful for the anchor. "How are you holding up?" he murmured, leaning close enough that his breath stirred the hair at her temple. "I want to leave," Lucille admitted. "Say the word." She looked at him, surprised. "Really? It's our wedding day, Duchess. We're allowed to be rude." The corner of his mouth lifted. "Besides, I've been wanting to get you alone for hours." Heat crept up Lucille's neck. The way he said it, not lecherous, not demanding, but intimate and honest, made her pulse quicken. "1 more hour," she decided, "then we can make our escape." 1 hour, Thomas agreed. "I'll time it." They lasted 45 minutes before Lady Margaret noticed them whispering and shooed them away with a knowing smile. "Go," she said. "You've done your duty. The rest is for you." Thomas didn't need to be told twice. He stood offering Lucille his hand with formal courtesy that didn't match the heat in his eyes. "Shall we, wife?" Lucille placed her hand in his. "We shall, husband." They made their exit through a shower of well wishes and knowing looks. A carriage waited, Thomas's carriage decorated with flowers and ribbons, ready to take them to Ashford House, Lucille's new home, though the reality of it hadn't quite sunk in yet. The ride was quiet. Lucille watched the countryside roll past, hyper-aware of Thomas beside her, of his thigh pressed against hers in the confined space, of the weight of what came next, settling over them like fog. "Nervous?" Thomas asked. "Should I be?" "That depends on your expectations." He shifted to face her more fully. "Lucille, I need you to know, tonight, tomorrow, whenever. There's no pressure, no requirements. We move at whatever pace feels right for you." Lucille's breath caught at the consideration in his voice, the care. "What about what feels right for you?" "What feels right for me is making sure you're comfortable." His hand found hers again, thumb stroking across her knuckles. "Everything else can wait." "Can it?" Lucille asked softly. "Can you wait?" Thomas's expression darkened with something that made her stomach flip. "I can wait forever if that's what you need." "But Lucille..." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to something rough and intimate. "I won't lie and say I don't want you. I've wanted you since you insulted me at dinner and looked at me like I was just a man instead of a title. So yes, I want you, but on your terms. Always on your terms." Lucille's heart hammered against her ribs. "What if my terms are now?" His hand tightened on hers. "Then now it is." The rest of the ride passed in charged silence. Ashford House rose from the landscape like something from a painting, all stone and windows and manicured grounds that went on forever. It was massive, intimidating, beautiful, and somehow, impossibly, it was now Lucille's home. Staff lined up to greet them, a sea of unfamiliar faces that Lucille would need to learn, names she'd need to remember. The housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, took charge with brisk efficiency, guiding them through welcomes and introductions. "The Duchess's chambers have been prepared," Mrs. Winters said, her tone formal but kind, "and the Duke's chambers are adjoining, should you need anything, Your Grace." Adjoining. Of course they were adjoining. That was expected, normal. So why did it make Lucille's pulse race? "Thank you, Mrs. Winters," Thomas said smoothly. "We'll take some time to settle in. Please ensure we're not disturbed unless it's urgent." "Of course, Your Grace." The staff dispersed with practiced efficiency, leaving Lucille and Thomas alone in the grand entrance hall. The silence echoed. "Would you like a tour?" Thomas asked. "Or would you rather see your chambers first?" "Chambers first," Lucille decided. "I need space to think." If he was disappointed, he didn't show it. He simply offered his arm and guided her up a sweeping staircase that probably cost more than her family's entire estate. Lucille's chambers were stunning. A sitting room decorated in soft blues and creams, a bedroom with a four-poster bed that could comfortably sleep 4 people, windows overlooking gardens that seemed to stretch to the horizon. It was beautiful, elegant, and absolutely overwhelming. "Is it acceptable?" Thomas asked, hovering in the doorway. "If you want anything changed, just tell Mrs. Winters. This is your space, Lucille, your sanctuary." Lucille turned to face him, this man who was her husband, standing in the doorway like he needed permission to enter her room. "Thomas." "Yes?" "Come in." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click that felt monumental. They stood in the sitting room, 5 feet of charged space between them, neither knowing quite what to do next. "We're married," Lucille said, stating the obvious. "We are. And this is our wedding night." "It is. So what happens now?" Thomas's expression softened into something almost tender. "Whatever we want to happen." Lucille took a breath, gathering courage. "I want to know you. Really know you. Not the Duke, not the businessman, not the man everyone else sees. Just you." "That's a dangerous request. I'm a dangerous woman." His laugh was low, rich, real. "You certainly are." He crossed the room slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wanted. Lucille held her ground. When he was close enough to touch, he raised his hand, hesitating. "May I?" he asked quietly. Lucille nodded, not trusting her voice. His fingers traced the line of her jaw, feather-light, reverent. "You were beautiful today. So beautiful it hurt to look at you." "That's just the dress." "No." His thumb brushed across her lower lip, making her breath hitch. "It's you. It's always been you." Lucille's hands came up to rest against his chest, feeling his heartbeat, rapid, matching hers. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Of me? Of this? Of feeling too much too fast? Of..." She stopped, swallowed hard. "Of loving you. And losing you." Thomas's expression cracked open, revealing raw vulnerability. "I'm scared of the same thing." "You are?" Terrified. His forehead dropped to rest against hers, their breath mingling. "Lucille, I've spent years building walls, protecting myself, keeping everyone at arm's length because distance meant safety. And then you walked into my life and demolished every defense I had. And I don't know how to do this, how to be vulnerable, how to need someone, how to..." Lucille kissed him. It was different from their other kisses. Slower, deeper, weighted with intention and choice and the acknowledgement of what they were becoming. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and Lucille melted into him, giving in to the want that had been building between them since that first night. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas's eyes were dark with desire and something deeper. "Stay with me tonight," Lucille said. "Not in the adjoining room. Here, with me." "Lucille, I'm not asking for anything except your presence, your company, your..." She stopped, searching for the right word. "Your honesty. Just stay." His hands tightened on her waist. "I don't trust myself to just stay." "Then don't just stay." Lucille met his gaze steadily, letting him see her choice, her certainty. "Be here. With me. Completely." Understanding flickered across his face. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Thomas's control visibly frayed. He pulled her closer, one hand tangling in her carefully pinned hair, the other spanning her lower back. When he kissed her this time, it was with barely restrained hunger, a promise and a question and a beginning all at once. Lucille answered by pressing closer, by opening to him, by letting herself fall into whatever this was becoming. They moved to the bedroom without breaking contact, hands exploring, breaths mingling, the world narrowing to just this, just them. What followed was tender and awkward and perfect, whispered reassurances and breathless laughter, and moments of profound connection that transcended the physical. Thomas was gentle, patient, attentive, learning her, memorizing her, worshipping her with a reverence that made Lucille's chest ache. And when it was over, when they lay tangled together in sheets that smelled like lavender, Thomas pressed a kiss to her hair and whispered, "Thank you." Lucille traced patterns on his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady beneath her palm. For what? For choosing me, for trusting me, for, his voice caught, for being you. Lucille tilted her head up to look at him. In the lamplight, his features were softened, made vulnerable. This was the man beneath the title, scared and hopeful and real. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she admitted quietly. Thomas's breath stuttered. His arms tightened around her, pulling her impossibly closer. "Good," he whispered against her hair, "because I've already fallen." And there, in the quiet aftermath of their first night as husband and wife, Lucille felt something inside her settle. This was right. This was home. This was exactly where she was meant to be. Lucille woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows, and Thomas's arm draped across her waist. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then memory flooded back. The wedding, the carriage ride, the night, and heat crept up her neck. She was married. She was a duchess. She was in Thomas's bed. Their bed now. "You're thinking too loud," Thomas murmured against her shoulder, his voice rough with sleep. "I can practically hear your thoughts spiraling." "I don't spiral." "You absolutely spiral." He pressed a kiss to her bare shoulder, lazy and affectionate. "What catastrophe are you imagining now?" Lucille turned in his arms, facing him. His hair was a disaster, his face stubbled with a night's growth of beard, his eyes still heavy with sleep. He looked nothing like a duke, and everything like a man who'd spent the night thoroughly loving his wife. He looked perfect. "I'm not imagining catastrophe," Lucille said. "I'm just processing." "Processing what?" "That this is real, that we're married, that last night actually happened." Thomas's expression softened. He reached up, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Regrets?" "No," Lucille said immediately, honestly. "Not even a little." Relief flickered across his face. "Good, because I have plans for you, Duchess." "Plans?" "Many plans." He pulled her closer, nuzzling into her neck in a way that made her laugh and squirm. "Starting with never leaving this bed. We have to leave this bed eventually." "Do we?" "I'm a duke. I can make proclamations. I hereby decree that we shall remain in bed for—" He considered this seriously. "At least 3 days." 3 days? I'm being generous. I initially thought a month." Lucille laughed, the sound bright and genuine. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed like this, unself-conscious, joyful, free. "What about food?" she asked. "We'll have it brought up. And your estate business?" "Can wait." "And society's expectations?" Thomas pulled back just enough to meet her gaze, his expression suddenly serious. "Society can go to hell. You're my priority now. This—" He gestured between them. "Us. That's what matters." Lucille's throat tightened. "You mean that?" "I always mean what I say to you." She kissed him then, pouring everything she couldn't quite say into it. Gratitude and affection, and the terrifying, exhilarating feeling of falling deeper by the moment. When they finally surfaced, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I know we said this was supposed to be practical, a partnership, but Lucille—" "I know," she whispered. "It's not anymore." "No, it's not." His hand cupped her face, thumb stroking her cheekbone. "It's so much more than that, and it terrifies me." "Me too. But we'll figure it out." "Together," Lucille confirmed. They stayed in bed for another hour, talking and laughing and memorizing each other. Eventually, practicality won. Hunger and the need for a bath couldn't be ignored forever. But even getting up felt different now. Easier, like they'd crossed some invisible threshold and everything on this side was lighter, brighter. The next weeks unfolded like a dream Lucille never knew she'd wanted. Ashford House became home faster than she'd expected. The staff warmed to her. Mrs. Winters became an ally, and slowly, Lucille began to understand the scope of her new role. She wasn't just a duchess in name. She had responsibilities, opportunities, power to effect real change. Thomas encouraged all of it. When Lucille expressed interest in the estate's tenant farms, he introduced her to his land manager and stepped back, letting her learn. When she mentioned wanting to establish a school for the local children, he immediately allocated funds and resources. When she admitted she'd always wanted to write, he had a study prepared for her, complete with a massive desk and shelves waiting to be filled with her work. He gave her everything he'd promised: freedom, partnership, respect, and somehow more. But it wasn't perfect. They argued spectacularly and often. Lucille challenged his business decisions, he questioned her impulses, and neither of them was particularly good at backing down. But after every fight, they came back together, talked it through, found compromise or understanding or at least agreement to disagree. It was messy and complicated and real. It was a marriage. One evening, 3 months after their wedding, Lucille found Thomas in his study, surrounded by papers and looking exhausted. She leaned against the doorframe, studying him. "You're working too hard," she observed. "Pot, meet kettle." But he set down his pen, giving her his full attention. "What are you doing here? I thought you were writing." "I was, but I missed you." Something in his expression melted. "Come here." Lucille crossed to his desk, and Thomas pulled her into his lap, burying his face in her neck. "I missed you too," he admitted. "Is that pathetic? We've been married 3 months and I still miss you when you're in another room." "It's not pathetic." Lucille combed her fingers through his hair, feeling him relax against her. "It's sweet." "I'm not sweet." "You're desperately sweet and you hate it." He bit her shoulder gently in retaliation, making her yelp and laugh. "Take it back." "Never." They stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped around each other, comfortable in the silence. Then Thomas said quietly, "I love you." Lucille's breath caught. He'd said it before, whispered it in the dark, murmured it during intimate moments. But never like this. Never clear and deliberate, and completely sober. "I love you," he repeated, pulling back to look at her. "I know we said this wasn't about love. I know we agreed it was practical and beneficial, and a dozen other bloodless words. But Lucille, I love you. Completely. Irrevocably. And I need you to know that." Tears prickled at Lucille's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "So much it scares me sometimes." "Good." He kissed her softly. "We can be scared together." 6 months after their wedding, Lucille discovered she was pregnant. She stared at the signs she'd been ignoring, the missed courses, the morning nausea, the exhaustion, and felt terror and joy war inside her chest. This wasn't part of the plan. They hadn't discussed children, hadn't agreed on timing, hadn't... "Lucille?" She looked up to find Thomas in the doorway of their bedroom, his expression concerned. "Are you all right? You've been quiet all morning." "I'm pregnant." The words fell between them like stones. Thomas froze, his face cycling through shock, disbelief, and something Lucille couldn't quite name. Then slowly, a smile broke across his features, wide and genuine and absolutely devastating. "You're pregnant," he repeated, crossing to her in 3 long strides. "We're having a baby. You're not upset?" "Upset?" He laughed, pulling her into his arms. "Lucille, I'm terrified. I'm going to be a terrible father. I barely had one of my own. I don't know what I'm doing, but..." He pulled back, framing her face with his hands. "But I'm so happy I can't breathe. We made this. Together." Lucille's tears finally spilled over. "We did. We did," he echoed, kissing her with a gentleness that made her chest ache. Their daughter was born 9 months later during a spring rainstorm that reminded Lucille of the night she'd first kissed Thomas. Labor was long and painful and terrifying, but Thomas stayed beside her the entire time, holding her hand, whispering encouragement, looking absolutely wrecked every time she cried out. When it was finally over, when the midwife placed a squalling, red-faced infant in Lucille's arms, Thomas broke down completely. He sat beside her on the bed, one arm around her shoulders, staring at their daughter like she'd hung the moon. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "She looks like you," Lucille said, tracing the baby's tiny features. "She has your eyes." "Poor thing. Lucille elbowed him gently. "Our daughter is beautiful." "Our daughter," Thomas repeated, testing the words. Then he looked at Lucille, and the love in his eyes was so profound it stole her breath. "Thank you for this, for her, for everything." Lucille leaned into him, exhausted and elated and overwhelmed. "Thank you for being brave enough to walk into that dining room a year ago. Thank you for being brave enough to say yes." They named her Helena after Thomas's grandmother. She was loud and demanding and absolutely perfect, and she changed everything while somehow making everything make sense. 2 years later, Lucille stood in Ashford House's library, holding Helena while the toddler tried to grab books off shelves. Thomas sat at the desk, supposedly working but mostly watching them with a softness that never failed to make Lucille's heart skip. "Do you remember," Lucille said, "when you told me this was just a practical arrangement?" Thomas looked up, his mouth curving. "I remember you insulting me at dinner. You deserved it. I absolutely did." He stood, crossing to them, and pressed a kiss to Helena's head, then Lucille's lips. "What made you think of it?" Lucille looked around the library, the room where so much of their relationship had unfolded, the window seat where she'd been reading when he first found her, the sofa where they'd fallen asleep and accidentally scandalized her mother, the space that had witnessed their arguments and reconciliations and quiet moments of connection. "I was just thinking about how wrong we both were," she said. "About what this would be." "Wrong how?" "You said you couldn't promise me love. But Thomas..." She shifted Helena to her hip, meeting his gaze steadily. "This is love. This life we've built. This chaos and partnership and daily choice to keep choosing each other. This is everything I never knew I wanted." Thomas's eyes went suspiciously bright. He wrapped his arms around both of them, pulling his family close. "You know what the worst part is?" "What?" "You were right. That first night, when you called me an arrogant fool who used his title as armor, because I didn't know who I was beneath it." He pulled back just enough to see her face. "You were completely right, but then you loved me anyway, the man underneath all the posturing. And you taught me how to be him." Lucille's throat tightened. "We taught each other." "We did." He kissed her again, deeper this time, only breaking apart when Helena protested loudly about being squished between them. "I love you, Lucille Volkov, my fierce, brilliant, beautiful wife." "I love you too, Thomas Volkov, my arrogant, sweet, impossibly stubborn husband." Helena chose that moment to grab Thomas's nose and yank hard, making him yelp, and Lucille dissolve into laughter. As Thomas gently extracted his nose from their daughter's grip, still laughing, Lucille thought, This is what happy ever after looks like. Not perfect, not easy, but honest and real and worth every risk they'd taken. An arrogant duke had showed up to her family dinner 2 years ago, and it had been love at first fight. And every day since, Lucille chose him. Every day since, he chose her. And that was more than enough. That was everything. "Thank you for being here." An arrogant duke showed up at her family dinner. It was love at first fight. If you like this story, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you liked most about Lucille and Thomas's journey. See you next time.